Rocky Mountain Wilderness, 1834. While other trappers threw up quick log cabins before winter, Pierre Leclerc was still digging trenches beneath his floorboards in late September. His neighbors called it impossible. They called him a fool for wasting time on what they saw as an underground heating system that could never work. He carved shallow channels into the earth, filled them with stones, and built his cabin partially below ground level, a design that took 2 months while others finished in 3 weeks. They mocked it as Pierre's beaver hole, insisting that a simple fire pit was all any mountain man needed to survive. Then November arrived early that year. The coldest winter in memory struck the Rockies. Temperatures plunged to 20 below zero for weeks. Standard log cabins failed completely. Frost formed 3 feet thick on the inside walls. Boots froze solid every morning, and firewood burned through in hours. But Pierre's cabin, it stayed a steady 60 degrees, warm and dry, even when his fire burned low. His impossible floor system used the thermal mass of heated stones and earth to store warmth and release it slowly throughout the night. What did this French-Canadian trapper understand about heat retention and thermal dynamics that every other mountain man dismissed as fantasy? And how did his ridiculous underground trenches become the difference between freezing and comfort when the worst winter in decades put everyone's survival methods to the ultimate test? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and time. We love reading where these documentaries reach. Pierre Leclerc first arrived in the Wind River Valley in the spring of 1833, carrying nothing but his traps, his tools, and 20 years of hard-earned knowledge about surviving in country that could kill a man 6 different ways before breakfast. The French-Canadian had learned his trade from his father in Quebec, then sharpened it through brutal seasons in the northern Rockies. But it was his winter spent with a Shoshone family near Jackson Hole that changed everything he thought he knew about staying warm. The Shoshone woman had laughed, actually laughed, when she saw how white trappers built their cabins. "You make cold houses," she told him in broken English, shaking her head at a neighboring trapper's hastily constructed log shelter. She led him to her family's winter lodge, a structure that seemed to draw warmth from the earth itself. The floor stayed warm even when the fire burned low, and Pierre spent hours studying the shallow trenches carved beneath the packed earth, filled with carefully selected stones that glowed with retained heat long after the flames died down. When Pierre selected his building site in the valley that summer, his fellow trappers assumed he'd follow the standard practice: find level, ground, cut logs, stack them quick and tight, throw on a roof, and call it done before the first snow. Mountain men prize speed above all else in cabin construction. The faster you got 4 walls and a roof, the faster you could get back to the serious business of laying trap lines and hunting game. Most cabins went up in 3 weeks, sometimes less if you had help and good weather. But Pierre had different plans. In late July, while his neighbors were already chinkling gaps between their logs, he was still clearing his site with methodical precision. He didn't just level the ground, he excavated it, digging down nearly 3 feet across an area 20 feet by 16 feet. His neighbors stopped by to watch, initially curious, then increasingly puzzled as Pierre's excavation grew deeper and more elaborate. "What in hell are you building, Pierre?" asked Tom Crawford, a Kentucky trapper who'd claimed land a quarter-mile downstream. "Looks like you're digging a root cellar big enough to live in." Pierre would just smile and keep digging. By early August, he'd carved a network of shallow trenches across the floor of his excavation, channels roughly 8 inches deep and 12 inches wide, running in parallel lines from what would become his fire area toward the outer walls. The trenches connected in a grid pattern that covered nearly the entire floor space. Other trappers gathered to study his work, shaking their heads at what seemed like an enormous waste of effort. "Man's building himself an underground maze," muttered Jake Morrison, a grizzled veteran of 15 Rocky Mountain winters. "Fire's supposed to heat the air, not warm up dirt nobody can see." Pierre ignored the commentary and began the most puzzling phase of his construction. He hauled stones from the creek bed, not random rocks, but carefully selected pieces of granite and sandstone, each roughly the size of a man's fist. He spent nearly 2 weeks gathering stones, testing their weight and density, rejecting pieces that felt too light or showed signs of cracking. When questioned about his selection process, Pierre would hold up 2 similar-looking rocks and say, "This one holds heat. This one doesn't. You feel the difference after they sit by fire." The stone placement followed a pattern that made sense only to Pierre. He layered the carefully chosen rocks in his trenches, creating what looked like primitive stone roadways beneath ground level. Between the stone-filled channels, he packed smaller gravel and sand, creating a drainage system that would keep moisture from collecting beneath his future floor. By September, while other trappers were finishing their roofs and stockpiling firewood, Pierre was just beginning to frame his walls. But even his wall construction defied convention. Instead of building at ground level, he built his log walls to sit partially below grade, with the floor level 18 inches down from the surrounding terrain. This meant his walls needed to be correspondingly higher to provide adequate interior height, requiring more logs and more labor than anyone else's cabin. "Pierre's building himself a fort to fight off ground squirrels," joked Crawford, watching Pierre notch logs that would sit half-buried when the cabin was complete. The foundation work consumed most of September. Pierre laid flat stones around the perimeter of his excavation, creating a moisture barrier between his buried logs and the earth. Then came the floor itself, not simple planks laid across floor joists, but a complex system of boards with gaps deliberately left between them. Pierre explained to anyone who'd listen that the gaps would allow warm air to circulate up from his stone-filled trenches, but his neighbors remained skeptical. "Gaps in the floor just let cold air in," said Morrison. "Basic common sense." Pierre's fireplace construction drew the most ridicule. Instead of building against an exterior wall like every other cabin in the valley, Pierre positioned his fireplace in the center of the cabin with the firebox elevated slightly above floor level. More puzzling still, he built what appeared to be secondary air channels leading from the fireplace area down into his network of stone-filled trenches. The system looked impossibly complex compared to the straightforward fire pits that heated every other cabin in the region. "Man's turning a simple cabin into some kind of contraption," observed Crawford. "Fire's supposed to burn wood and make heat. Don't need underground tunnels for that." As October arrived and the first hard frost settled into the valley, Pierre was still working on his heating system. He'd built adjustable dampers in his air channels, allowing him to control how much heated air flowed down into the stone-filled trenches beneath his floor. The system required constant fine-tuning, testing different damper positions, and airflow patterns while his neighbors enjoyed the simple warmth of their traditional fires. By mid-October, when smart trappers were checking their chinking and stacking extra firewood, Pierre's cabin remained a work in progress. His neighbors had moved on from curiosity to genuine concern about his sanity. The man was still adjusting stones in his underground channels while winter weather threatened to arrive any day. "Pierre's going to freeze to death in that beaver hole he's digging," Morrison told Crawford. "Mark my words, he'll be begging for space in a real cabin before Christmas." The first snow arrived on November 3rd, 2 weeks earlier than anyone in the valley had seen in recent memory. What started as light flurries at dawn became a steady snowfall by noon, and by evening 6 inches of powder covered the ground with temperatures dropping to 15 degrees below freezing. The mountain men had experienced early snow before, but this felt different, the kind of persistent cold that settled into the bones of the landscape and refused to leave. Tom Crawford's cabin, built with the tried-and-true methods his father had taught him in Kentucky, performed exactly as expected for the first few nights. His central fire pit threw adequate heat during the evening hours, warming the air near the ceiling while leaving the floor level noticeably cold. Like every mountain man, Crawford had learned to sleep close to the fire and wake periodically through the night to add logs. It was an accepted part of frontier life. You traded continuous sleep for continuous warmth. Jake Morrison's cabin followed the same pattern. His fire burned hot and bright until midnight, then gradually died to coals that provided minimal heat until morning. Morrison would wake to find his water bucket skimmed with ice and his breath visible in the frigid air. But these were familiar hardships that came with the territory. A man didn't choose the Rocky Mountain wilderness expecting comfort. Pierre's cabin, meanwhile, operated by entirely different rules. His central fireplace burned the same wood as his neighbors' fires, but the heat behaved in ways that defied conventional understanding. Instead of rising straight to the ceiling and dissipating, much of the warmth flowed down through his carefully constructed air channels into the stone-filled trenches beneath his floor. The heated stones absorbed and held the thermal energy, releasing it slowly and steadily throughout the night. By mid-November, the early snow had given way to sustained cold, unlike anything the valley had experienced in living memory. Temperatures dropped to 20 below zero and stayed there for days at a time. The cold penetrated everything. Leather goods froze stiff, metal tools became painful to touch with bare hands, and even seasoned mountain men found themselves struggling to maintain adequate warmth in their cabins. Crawford's morning routine became a race against hypothermia. He would wake before dawn to find his cabin interior hovering near freezing, despite banking his fire the night before. Ice formed on the inside surfaces of his log walls, creating a crystalline coating that never fully melted, even with the fire burning bright. His boots, left near the fire for warmth, would be frozen solid by morning, requiring careful thawing before he could force his feet inside. Morrison faced similar challenges with additional complications. His hastily constructed cabin had developed gaps between logs as the wood dried and contracted in the extreme cold. Wind whistled through these openings, creating drafts that made maintaining consistent interior temperature nearly impossible. He stuffed cloth and moss into the worst gaps, but cold air continued infiltrating his living space, no matter how large a fire he maintained. The fuel consumption became critical. Both Crawford and Morrison found themselves burning through their carefully stockpiled firewood at alarming rates. A typical winter fire might consume 12 to 15 logs overnight. In the sustained deep cold, they were feeding 25 to 30 logs into their fires just to maintain barely livable conditions. At this consumption rate, their winter wood supplies would be exhausted long before spring. Pierre's cabin continued operating by its own mysterious logic. His morning routine involved checking the damper settings in his air channels, adjusting the flow of heated air into his stone-filled trenches based on overnight temperature changes. The stones beneath his floor had absorbed heat throughout the previous day and continued radiating warmth upward through the deliberately gapped floorboards. His interior temperature remained steady around 55 to 60 degrees, even when his fire burned down to coals. The fuel efficiency became obvious to anyone who paid attention. While his neighbors were burning a cord of wood every 10 days, Pierre's consumption remained closer to a cord every 3 weeks. His heating system's thermal mass allowed him to maintain comfortable temperatures with significantly less fuel input, storing heat during peak burning periods and releasing it gradually during the coldest hours. December brought conditions that tested every survival method in the valley. A massive storm system settled over the region, producing sustained winds of 40 miles per hour and driving snow that accumulated faster than anyone could clear it. The storm lasted 4 days, with temperatures never rising above 30 below zero. Wind-driven snow found every gap and crevice in traditional cabin construction, infiltrating living spaces and creating interior conditions that bordered on uninhabitable. Crawford's cabin became a battlefield against the elements. Snow forced its way through chinks between logs, melting near his fire and refreezing in areas where heat couldn't reach. Ice accumulated on his interior walls to a thickness of nearly 2 inches, and maintaining any semblance of warmth required feeding his fire continuously throughout the day and night. Sleep became impossible, except for brief intervals between stoking sessions. Morrison's situation deteriorated to dangerous levels. His cabin's structural gaps allowed wind-driven snow to enter freely, creating conditions where interior and exterior temperatures differed by only 10 to 15 degrees despite his constant fire-tending efforts. Hypothermia became a genuine concern as his body's core temperature began dropping during sleep periods, forcing him to remain awake and active near his fire for dangerous stretches of time. Pierre's underground heating system proved its worth during the storm's worst phases. While wind battered his cabin's exterior, the buried portions of his structure remained insulated by surrounding earth. Snow that accumulated around his cabin actually provided additional insulation rather than creating infiltration problems. His stone-filled trenches continued absorbing and radiating heat with mechanical consistency, maintaining interior temperatures that allowed normal sleep cycles and daily activities. The The storm's aftermath revealed the full scope of the crisis facing traditional cabin construction. Both Crawford and Morrison had exhausted nearly half their winter wood supplies in 4 days of extreme weather, leaving them facing the prospect of dangerous fuel shortages with 3 months of winter remaining. Their cabins showed structural stress from freeze-thaw cycles, with new gaps opening between logs and existing chinks widening under thermal expansion and contraction. On December 20th, Tom Crawford made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable 3 months earlier. With his firewood supply dwindling to dangerous levels and ice coating the interior walls of his cabin thick enough to scrape with a knife, he swallowed his pride and walked the quarter-mile through knee-deep snow to Pierre's door. The French-Canadian answered wearing only a wool shirt, no heavy coat, no gloves, despite the fact that the morning temperature had registered 35 below zero on the thermometer Crawford had nailed to his own cabin wall. Crawford found Pierre's interior so warm that condensation fogged his spectacles the moment he stepped inside. The cabin felt like stepping into a different season. No ice coated the walls, no frost covered the windows. Pierre moved around his living space in shirt sleeves, comfortable enough to perform detailed tasks like mending traps and preparing meals without the constant distraction of numbing cold. "How?" was all Crawford managed to say, standing in Pierre's doorway with snow still melting from his boots. Pierre gestured toward his floor with quiet satisfaction. "Feel here," he said, guiding Crawford's hand to the wooden planks near the center of the cabin. The floor radiated warmth like a sun-heated stone in summer. Crawford knelt and pressed his palm flat against the boards, feeling consistent heat rising through the deliberately gapped flooring system that he had mocked just months before. Pierre opened one of his floor dampers, revealing the stone-filled trench beneath. Even 12 hours after his last major fire, the carefully selected rocks glowed with retained heat. Crawford reached down to touch one of the stones and jerked his hand back. The rock was too hot to handle with bare skin. The thermal mass Pierre had spent weeks creating was still actively radiating the heat it had absorbed the previous day. "The stones hold heat like iron holds, heat in blacksmith forge," Pierre explained, adjusting the damper to increase airflow from the trench. "Fire heats stones during day, stones heat cabin during night. Earth around stones keeps heat from escaping outside." Crawford spent 2 hours in Pierre's cabin, studying the heating system that had seemed like elaborate foolishness during construction, but now appeared to be engineering genius. The network of stone-filled trenches created a thermal battery beneath the entire living space. Pierre's central fireplace fed heated air down into this underground system through carefully positioned channels, and the buried stones absorbed and stored that thermal energy for gradual release through the floor. The fuel efficiency became obvious as Crawford watched Pierre's fire-tending routine. Instead of the frantic, continuous stoking required in traditional cabins, Pierre built substantial fires twice daily, morning and evening, then adjusted his damper system to control how much heat flowed into his stone trenches. The rocks beneath his floor continued providing consistent warmth for 8 to 10 hours after each fire, eliminating the need for midnight fuel additions that had become Crawford's exhausting routine. Jake Morrison arrived at Pierre's cabin 3 days later, drawn by the same desperate mathematics that had driven Crawford. Morrison's wood supply had reached crisis levels. At his current consumption rate, he faced complete fuel exhaustion by early February, with 2 months of winter still ahead. His hands shook from constant cold exposure, and his speech had developed the slightly slurred quality that experienced mountain men recognized as an early sign of chronic hypothermia. Pierre welcomed Morrison with the same quiet generosity he had shown Crawford, sharing hot coffee and demonstrating his heating system's operation. Morrison knelt beside the open damper and stared into the stone-filled trench like a man examining a miracle. The rocks radiated heat so intense that Morrison had to shield his face while peering into the channel. "This don't make sense according to everything I know about fires," Morrison muttered, but his tone held wonder rather than skepticism. "Fire burns up, heat rises up. How's this making heat go down into the ground?" Pierre showed him the air circulation pattern that made the system work. Cool air entered the fireplace at floor level, heated rapidly in the firebox. then flowed down through stone-lined channels that Pierre had constructed with precise gradients. The heated air moved through the underground network, transferring thermal energy to the carefully selected rocks before rising back to floor level through the gaps between floorboards. The system created a continuous circulation loop that distributed heat throughout the entire cabin, rather than concentrating it near the ceiling. The technical precision became apparent as Morrison studied Pierre's construction details. The stone selection hadn't been random. Pierre had chosen rocks based on their thermal mass properties, testing each stone's ability to absorb and retain heat. Dense granite and sandstone pieces provided maximum thermal storage, while lighter stones served as spacers to maintain proper airflow through the channels. The trench depths and widths followed measurements Pierre had learned from the Shoshone, optimized through generations of cold weather survival. Morrison's amazement grew as Pierre demonstrated the system's controllability. By adjusting dampers at different points in the underground network, Pierre could direct more or less heated air to specific areas of his cabin. He could warm the sleeping area while allowing the food storage area to remain cooler, or he could balance heat distribution to compensate for wind direction and external temperature changes. "You built yourself a furnace that runs underneath your whole cabin," Morrison said, understanding dawning in his voice. "And them stones down there are like a bank account for heat." Word of Pierre's successful heating system spread beyond Crawford and Morrison. Other trappers in the broader valley began arriving to study the mysterious floor that kept one man warm while everyone else fought hypothermia. They came skeptically, prepared to find some trick or exaggeration, but left convinced that Pierre had solved the fundamental problem of Rocky Mountain winter survival. The visitors examined every aspect of Pierre's construction, asking detailed questions about stone selection, trench depth, damper placement, and air circulation patterns. Pierre answered with generous patience, explaining the principles he had learned from the Shoshone and refined through careful experimentation. He drew diagrams in the dirt near his fireplace, showing how heated air moved through his underground system and why thermal mass provided more consistent warmth than direct fire heat. By late January, Pierre's cabin had become an informal school for advanced heating techniques. Mountain men who had mocked his construction methods now took careful notes on his stone selection criteria and memorized his damper adjustment procedures. They measured his trench dimensions and studied his air channel gradients, preparing to incorporate his innovations into their own survival strategies. The transformation in attitude was complete. Pierre's impossible floor heating system had evolved from community joke to essential knowledge, proving that survival in extreme conditions often required abandoning conventional wisdom in favor of methods that actually worked. By February 1st, Tom Crawford had torn up half the floorboards in his cabin and begun excavating the trenches that would transform his frozen living space into something habitable. The work proved brutal in winter conditions. Digging through ground that had frozen solid required heating the earth with repeated fires before each shovelful could be removed. Crawford worked in shifts, building fires directly on his cabin floor to thaw sections of ground, then frantically digging before the earth refroze. Pierre arrived each morning to supervise Crawford's retrofit, bringing the careful technical knowledge that separated successful heating systems from dangerous failures. The stone selection remained critical even in retrofit situations. Crawford had initially planned to use whatever rocks he could find near his cabin, but Pierre insisted on the same rigorous testing process that had guided his original construction. "This stone holds heat 2 hours. This stone holds heat 6 hours," Pierre explained, holding two similar-looking pieces of granite. "Wrong stones waste your work and waste your wood." Pierre taught Crawford to test thermal retention by heating rocks in his fire, then timing how long each stone remained too hot to handle with bare hands. Only stones that retained heat for 4 hours or more earned places in Crawford's underground channels. The trench excavation followed Pierre's precise measurements, 8 inches deep, 12 inches wide, with gradients calculated to maintain proper air circulation throughout the system. Crawford discovered that even small deviations from these specifications affected system performance. When he cut one trench only 6 inches deep to avoid a stubborn tree root, that section failed to heat properly until Pierre insisted he deepen it to match the other channels. Jake Morrison began his own retrofit 3 weeks later, learning from Crawford's mistakes while facing additional complications from his cabin's structural problems. The gaps between Morrison's logs had widened during the extreme cold, creating air leaks that interfered with proper heat circulation. Before beginning his floor excavation, Morrison spent days rechinking his walls with moss, clay, and strips of hide to create the sealed environment that Pierre's heating system required. Morrison's retrofit revealed the importance of Pierre's original decision to build below grade. Morrison's cabin sat at ground level, which meant his stone-filled trenches couldn't extend as deep as Pierre's system. Pierre compensated by teaching Morrison to build thermal mass chambers, wider sections in the trench network, where extra stones could be packed to increase heat storage capacity, despite the shallower depth. The damper construction proved the most technically challenging aspect of the retrofit process. Pierre's original dampers had been built into his cabin structure during construction, integrated seamlessly with his fireplace design. Crawford and Morrison had to create retrofit dampers that could control airflow into their underground systems without major reconstruction of their existing fireplaces. Pierre solved this problem by designing adjustable stone slabs that could be positioned at the entrances to each trench system. These primitive dampers allowed the men to control how much heated air flowed into their thermal mass storage, though the system required more manual adjustment than Pierre's built-in dampers. Crawford and Morrison learned to read the subtle signs that indicated proper damper settings, the sound of air moving through their trenches, the temperature of their floor surfaces, and the rate at which their fires consumed fuel. The first successful test of Crawford's system came during a 3-day cold snap in mid-February, when temperatures dropped to 40 below zero. Crawford built his evening fire as Pierre had taught him, then closed his dampers to direct maximum heated air into his stone-filled trenches. The rocks beneath his floor absorbed heat throughout the evening, and Crawford went to sleep without the familiar anxiety about his fire dying during the night. He woke 8 hours later to find his cabin interior at a comfortable 50 degrees, despite his fire having burned down to cold ashes. The stones beneath his floor continued radiating heat upward through his floorboards, providing the consistent overnight warmth that had eluded him throughout the brutal winter. For the first time in months, Crawford slept through the night without waking to tend his fire. Morrison's system began working 2 weeks later, after Pierre helped him solve circulation problems caused by his cabin's irregular floor layout. Morrison's hastily built cabin had an L-shaped floor plan that created dead zones where heated air couldn't circulate properly. Pierre designed a modified trench network with additional cross-channels that distributed heat to all areas of Morrison's living space. The fuel savings became immediately apparent in both retrofit installations. Crawford's wood consumption dropped from a cord every 10 days to a cord every 18 days, still higher than Pierre's original system due to retrofit inefficiencies, but sustainable through the remainder of winter. Morrison achieved similar improvements, reducing his fuel needs enough to stretch his remaining wood supply through March. Other mountain men in the valley watched these successful retrofits with growing interest. Word spread beyond the immediate area as trappers shared information during their periodic supply runs to trading posts. Men who had initially dismissed Pierre's heating system as an isolated eccentricity now recognized it as a replicable technology that could solve the fundamental problem of Rocky Mountain winter survival. Samuel Hendricks, a veteran trapper from the next valley east, arrived in late February, specifically to study Pierre's system before building his own cabin the following season. Hendricks brought detailed questions about construction techniques, having heard conflicting reports about the complexity and effectiveness of underground heating. Pierre spent 3 days teaching Hendricks the complete system, from initial site excavation through daily operation and maintenance. Hendricks took careful notes on stone selection criteria, documenting the thermal retention testing process and the specific rock types that performed best in Pierre's system. He measured trench dimensions and studied the air circulation patterns that made the heating system work efficiently. Pierre shared the subtle operational knowledge that separated successful systems from failures, how to read the signs of proper damper adjustment, how to balance heat storage with immediate warming needs, and how to maintain consistent performance through varying weather conditions. The knowledge transfer extended beyond pure, technical details. Pierre taught Hendricks the seasonal preparation required for optimal system performance. how to gather and cure the proper stones during summer months, how to position trenches for maximum thermal efficiency, and how to integrate the heating system with other aspects of cabin design. The floor heating technology demanded more initial effort than traditional construction, but it provided dramatically superior performance throughout the winter months when survival depended on maintaining adequate warmth with limited fuel resources. By March, Pierre's heating innovation had evolved from individual solution to community knowledge, spreading through the informal networks that connected isolated mountain men across hundreds of miles of wilderness territory. Spring arrived in the Wind River Valley with the gradual certainty that Pierre Leclerc had fundamentally changed how men would survive Rocky Mountain winters. As snow melted from cabin roofs and revealed the structural damage that extreme cold had inflicted on traditional construction, the contrast between Pierre's methods and conventional wisdom became undeniable. Crawford's and Morrison's cabins showed stress fractures where logs had contracted and expanded through repeated freeze-thaw cycles, while Pierre's partially buried structure emerged from winter looking exactly as it had in November. Samuel Hendricks returned to his own valley carrying detailed plans for Pierre's heating system, but he also carried something more valuable, the understanding that survival technology could be improved through careful observation and systematic experimentation. Hendricks began building his cabin in May, incorporating not just Pierre's heating design, but also his approach to site selection, excavation techniques, and seasonal preparation. The floor heating system required forward planning that most mountain men had never considered necessary. Word of Pierre's success reached the trading post at South Pass by midsummer, spreading through the informal communication network that connected trappers across the territory. Veteran mountain men who had dismissed reports of underground heating as tall tales began seeking first-hand accounts from men who had seen Pierre's system in operation. The stories were consistent. One French-Canadian trapper had solved the fuel consumption problem that killed men every winter, and his solution could be replicated by anyone willing to invest the additional construction effort. Jean Baptiste, a mixed-blood trapper with connections to both French voyageur traditions and tribal heating methods, arrived at Pierre's cabin in August with specific technical questions. Baptiste had heard versions of similar heating techniques from Ojibwe relatives in Minnesota, but he wanted to understand how Pierre had adapted the principles for log cabin construction. The two men spent a week discussing thermal mass theory, stone selection criteria, and the air circulation, patterns that made underground heating systems function efficiently. Baptiste's visit established Pierre's innovation within a broader context of indigenous heating technologies that had been developing across North America for centuries. Pierre's genius lay not in inventing thermal mass heating, but in successfully integrating traditional principles with frontier construction methods and available materials. His system represented a synthesis of French-Canadian building skills, Shoshone thermal engineering, and practical adaptations forced by Rocky Mountain conditions. The technical knowledge began spreading systematically rather than randomly. Baptiste carried Pierre's heating plans to the Green River Rendezvous, where trappers from across the mountain west gathered annually to trade furs and exchange information. Men who had never heard Pierre's name learned about stone-filled trenches and thermal mass storage from trappers who had studied his system firsthand. The heating technology entered the collective knowledge base that kept mountain men alive in hostile territory. By 1836, Pierre's floor heating system had reached the Columbia River Valley, carried by trappers who moved seasonally between different regions. Marcus Whitman, the missionary doctor establishing settlements in Oregon Territory, encountered the heating technique at a remote trading post and immediately recognized its potential for permanent homestead construction. Whitman requested detailed plans from men who had built similar systems, understanding that reliable heating technology would determine whether families could survive Pacific Northwest winters. The system's evolution continued as different builders adapted Pierre's basic design to varying conditions and available materials. Trappers in areas with limited stone supplies learned to use thermal mass alternatives, packed earth mixed with charcoal, clay chambers filled with sand, or even metal objects salvaged from abandoned settlements. The core principle remained constant: create underground thermal storage that could absorb heat during peak burning periods and release it gradually throughout the coldest hours. Pierre himself began receiving visitors from hundreds of miles away, men who made deliberate journeys to study his heating system before building their own cabins. He welcomed these students with patient generosity, understanding that survival knowledge belonged to the entire mountain community rather than to individual inventors. Pierre's technical explanations became increasingly sophisticated as he learned to communicate thermal dynamics concepts to men with varying levels of construction experience. The heating system's reputation extended beyond practical effectiveness to include economic advantages that appealed to profit-minded trappers. Men using Pierre's technology could maintain comfortable living conditions while consuming 60% less firewood than traditional heating methods required. This fuel efficiency translated directly into reduced labor. Less time spent cutting, splitting, and hauling wood meant more time available for trapping and hunting activities that generated income. Cabin construction throughout the Rocky Mountain region began reflecting Pierre's influence by the late 1830s. New cabins increasingly featured below-grade construction, stone-filled thermal mass systems, and central fireplace positioning that optimized heat distribution. The changes happened gradually as individual builders incorporated elements of Pierre's design into their own construction practices, creating regional variations that adapted his basic principles to local conditions and available materials. The heating technology proved particularly valuable for families attempting to establish permanent homesteads rather than seasonal hunting camps. Women and children required more consistent warmth than single trappers, and Pierre's system provided the reliable interior temperatures that made family life possible in extreme climates. Homesteaders began seeking out men with experience building thermal mass heating systems, paying premium wages for construction knowledge that could mean the difference between successful settlement and winter evacuation. Pierre's innovation had transformed from individual solution to regional standard within 5 years of its first implementation. Trading post operators reported increasing demand for the specific types of stones that worked best in thermal mass systems. Experienced mountain men commanded higher wages if they could demonstrate knowledge of underground heating construction. The heating technology had become valuable intellectual property within the frontier economy. By 1840, Pierre Leclerc's floor heating system represented established best practice for Rocky Mountain winter survival, taught routinely to newcomers, and incorporated automatically into cabin construction planning. What had seemed like impossible complexity during that first winter had become standard technique, proving that practical innovation could spread rapidly through communities that valued survival above convention.